Protests against the use of deadly force by police swept across the country in 2015. That year, the Washington Post began tallying how many people were shot and killed by police, and they found that since 2015, police have shot and killed 5,400 people. Joining us now in this investigative report is investigative reporter for the Washington Post, John Sullivan. John, thank you for joining us. These numbers are staggering.
Yeah, the numbers are large, 1,000 people a year, and that number is incredibly consistent no matter what's going on. Declines in crime, increases in crime, that number seems to stay exactly about 1,000 per year.
And after every shooting, for the most part, there are some calls for, changes in policies, especially after this past one with George Floyd. It's loud, very, very loud calls for changes in policy and procedure. Despite any sort of modifications to these policies, assuming they had been made, these numbers they've stayed pretty consistent.
Yeah, the remarkable thing is that there are departments that have undertaken reforms. They've focused on this. They've emphasized things like the sanctity of life. They've tried to train officers to make better tactical decisions. And we've seen some declines in some big departments, but the number seems to be made up in other suburban and rural departments when they go down in bigger cities.
Now, do we have a breakdown in terms of, the number of people that are black versus white versus Asian versus Hispanic, and which ones were armed and those that were unarmed?
We do. About 70% of the people police shoot and kill are armed, either with a gun or a knife. That's a large percentage. America is a country with lots of guns, about 280 million, according to a lot of estimates. So police officers face a lot of people with guns. When you look at the breakdown by race, about 45% of those shot and killed by police are white men. About 23% are black men. And if you look at armed and unarmed, about each year, 50 people a year are shot and killed who are unarmed. The first year we tallied it, about 94 people were shot and killed who were unarmed. Most of those people, or many of those people, were black men. The next year, the number went down to about 50, and the number of black men shot and killed while unarmed by police also declined. And that decline has stayed current through this year.
Now, I was reading the information that you sent over to us, and I was also reading information on other websites. There's mappingpoliceviolence.org. And I was reading that most killings, regardless of race, begin with responding to suspected non-violent offenses or cases where no crime was reported. That's also very shocking, too, because you think, a violent crime that may lead to some sort of altercation or scuffle between the suspect and the law enforcement official, but that's not necessarily the case.
Well, actually, there's a lot of cases that come from domestic violence calls. About 18% of all the fatal police shootings start with some kind of domestic violence call, a 911 call. Traffic stops tend to be less represented. And again, police officers shoot a lot of people who are armed, and that is a big number. We have to always recognize that they are facing off against a lot of guns in America.
And I know one of the standard procedures across the board for police officers is they are technically allowed to use deadly force when faced with deadly force. I'm not sure if you spoke to any police officers. What's their take on it? I know a lot of people right now are very much, I don't want to say they're very much anti-law enforcement or anti-police, but they're coming under fire over the course of the last 2 weeks and over the last few years. What do they say, if you've had a chance to speak with any of them, with regard to just kind of being in the situation that they're in, where they may be faced with the notion of life or death? They have families at home. Are there any statements or any things that they are saying with I guess in their defense?
Sure. Police chiefs say, look, we've tried to focus on this. We've tried to reduce the number. But again, we face a lot of people with firearms, and you can't ask an officer to not defend themselves when they're faced with somebody who's armed with a gun. The other side is they say there's still some areas where they can improve. For example, about 25% of the people shot and killed by police are mentally ill or showing signs of mental distress. that's an area where they think they can make some progress through some kinds of strategies like de-escalation. But there are 18,000 police departments in America, and a lot of them are small departments, one officer or so. And so getting training to all those places, getting that kind of standardized understanding of how to deal with people who are mentally ill, that's a real difficulty. I think that's the challenge that policing faces right now in America.
Could we say that there are arguably more police officers, I guess, stationed or out on patrol in lower socioeconomic areas versus, more affluent areas?
I think that police departments do tend to focus their resources on poor communities. So I think you do see, a lot of communities who feel like they're over-policed say, if you policed white communities like this or rich communities like this, you might see kind of an evening out of some of these disparities.
Because that's not to say that crimes don't happen in the more affluent areas either, but if there are less police officers in those areas and they're, kind of in the poorer areas, the probability of finding crimes or having law enforcement versus civilian interactions is obviously going to be higher in those poorer areas.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of the debate about these numbers are, what is a fair comparison? Do we compare these numbers to the population as a whole, or do we break it down by the percentage of people who commit crimes? Well, the reality is that in America today, every interaction with a police officer could potentially produce a fatal police shooting. And so our practice, after talking to statisticians and other criminologists, has been to compare this number to the population at large.
And a little earlier you mentioned de-escalation. One statistic that I had read is that police recruits spend, 7 times as many hours on training with regard to shooting versus de-escalation training. How would, I guess if you already have a task force, a series of police officers already in a department that are already trained that much more heavily in shooting, how do you kind of go about, I guess, not reversing, but balancing that out? You can always do the new recruits more hours, but when it comes to the older police officers, how do you kind of balance that out when they've been doing it a certain way for so long?
I think that's what a lot of police chiefs and other leaders and thought leaders in policing are starting to try to grapple with. One of the things is, can we have a culture change and how police view their job? Is it preservation of life or is it protection of the public? So I think, as the larger departments go through some of this training and experiment with it, and, even in Minneapolis, they were undergoing a pretty sophisticated training program to try to help them understand kind of historic treatment of police of communities of color and how that's affected their community. They were going through kind of implicit bias training. So I do think there are some models developing, and I think once those models are implemented in the larger departments and shown to have some kind of effect, we might see some changes. You have to remember these numbers are a lagging indicator. So you may see some progress, or it may have made some progress, and it doesn't show up in the numbers for a couple of years out. And I think one of the areas where we have seen some progress, although I think a lot of statisticians would argue the numbers are very small and it's hard to draw conclusions from them, is that we have seen a reduction in the number of unarmed Black people shot in America.
Well, that's good to hear, and hopefully we do continue moving in that direction. And given the the situation that we've been kind of faced with in these last couple of weeks, hopefully that'll take the number down even further. John, is there anything else that you think is important with regard to the research that you conducted on this that you kind of want to touch on?
Yeah, I think that probably the most important thing, and the Washington Post started this database 5 years ago after the shooting of Michael Brown. It's not a perfect database. It does a great job of trying to show how many shootings, fatal police shootings there are in America. And up until this point, the FBI tracked it and they undercounted it by half. I think the federal government, there's an opportunity here in their new collection system and their new data collection system about fatal use of force or use of force that causes injuries and harm, to make that system more robust, to gather the kind of data that would help the public really understand what is going on in policing in America. I think it would help everybody, police, and I think it would help communities understand kind of where do we begin with this.
I definitely think people will be paying more attention to these numbers. So as I mentioned, hopefully we continue in this downward trend with regard to racial bias when it comes to law enforcement. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.